It's really wonderful to chair and moderate this panel, Materials That Matter, Battle for Securing Critical Supply Chains. It's certainly not the first time that we talk about critical raw materials, metals and minerals, or other very important components for production. But it is with a much greater urgency than we have done in the past. And why we are doing this is because we learned about new risks and new vulnerabilities. And these have been unveiled both through supply chain interruptions during the COVID pandemic, as well as in the subsequent time or as the effects of Russia's war on Ukraine. But it's not the only reason why there is a battle or a competition for resources. It's also because we need them so urgently for the digital transformation, the digital revolution, but also for the green transformation and for climate change adaptation and policies. And so the title of this panel is very well chosen, saying Materials That Matter, Battle for Securing Critical Supply Chains. And I want to thank the organizers of this conference for putting this panel and also the whole conference so masterfully together and choosing the titles also in such a creative way. And this is how I would also like to start out our panel. Our esteemed and honorable panelists have already been introduced to you, so I'm not going to do it again in the matter of saving a little bit of time so that we have more time for discussion and then also bringing in you with questions and also comments. What I want to ask our panelists, and that's going to be the first round, is if we are talking about a battle for resources, for materials, or also for semiconductors or other important inputs, how fierce is this battle and why is it, or why do you come to such a conclusion? And because we all like numbers, I would like to ask my panelists to give us a number for 1 not fierce at all and 10 very fierce. I would like to start with Janka, and so that you know, I'm going to address Janka by her first name because we've been very old, long-time friends. I also very much like all the other panelists, but because we haven't been friends for such a long time, I'm going to stick with last names and ministers. Okay. So, Janka, please, on a scale 1 to 10, how fierce is the battle?
Thank you, Stormy, very much for this introduction. So my number is 8. If we define it as global competition, and if we define it as technology and critical materials. So if we define it a bit broader. Why 8? Because I think it's pretty bad, but it could actually get much worse. And I think we haven't even begun to imagine how bad it could become. On a tension level, I think at the EU we're more like at a 6 at the moment. That's better than 0. But it's certainly not up to where it should be, which is probably about at 8 as well at the moment in comparison to all the other things that we have to deal with.
Okay, just to make sure. So 8 is pretty bad, right?
8's pretty bad, yeah. I mean, it's pretty rough. I mean, there's escalation zones, but 8, I would say, is not a good zone that we're in.
All right. And you are talking about a battle, not competition.
No, I would call this a battle.
You would call it a battle. All right. Mr. Abbott, what would you say?
Well, I think it depends on the circumstances, and at the moment, I'd probably say it's about a 5, but I can easily envisage circumstances where a global trade would be radically disrupted, and in that case, it would be about a 10.
And would you call it a battle, or is it rather still competition?
Look, as we saw during the pandemic, if you need something badly, you need it immediately. And as we discovered during the pandemic, when all of a sudden everyone in the world wanted masks, gloves, PPE, ventilators, antibiotics, etc., there was none to be had. None to be had because A, everyone wanted it, and B, most of it was coming from China. And so there was this mad, desperate scramble. Now, eventually, supply started to come into equilibrium. But if there was another period of great disruption, well then this would go from something that is nice to do to something which is absolutely 100% vitally urgent.
Thank you so very much. And later on in one of our next rounds, we are also going to talk about the instruments of the battle and how to secure access. Minister Billström, in your opinion, where does the battle stand?
Well, thank you very much. I would give it 7 out of 10. I think it's quite clear that governments are paying more attention nowadays to supply chains, and that is also reflected in a more, well, just as we have here today, more public debate, more active public debate on the matter. And I think that this is something which we have to deal with as decision makers all around the world right now.
And if I may ask, is the battle fierce for everybody in the same way?
Well, first of all, describing it as a battle, I think is, in my view, it's a bit misleading, I would say. But I do think that we have to pay a lot of attention to these questions because they are vital for everything, for production, for manufacturing, and for transportation, logistics, etc., for the entire world economy.
Since you already said it's maybe a little bit misleading to talk about a battle, why is it misleading?
Because it's not really a battle. What it is about is to try and improve these supply chains through cooperation and through engagement. And this, I think, is sometimes, if you use the word battle, you don't understand that cooperation actually comes into the play. I think that we should step up our engagement in questions like open sea lice communication. I'm also very much with Mr. Abbott when it comes to reflections on what COVID actually meant to supply chains, the harsh lessons that it taught us. I also would like to, throw in a word for the Indo-Pacific on this, because that partnership is a very strong example of the need for cooperation. And I think this is something which differs us who believe in cooperation from those who view it as a battle.
Great, thank you so much. Lots of things to think about in all 3 comments so far. Minister Chandrasekhar, in your opinion, how fierce is the battle on a scale 1 to 10?
So again, thank you again. So there was a 5, 7, and an 8. So I'll chip in with a 6. So just to make sure that I'm not infringing on anybody else's number. No, I certainly don't think this is a battle. I think it's a competition, and I don't believe that this is some new phenomenon that we are seeing in the world. There's always been a competition for resources. In the past, it was hydrocarbon, energy, and then we moved on to some things. And it is certainly clear that in the last 3-4 years, this rapid acceleration of digitization has caused these demand spikes in areas that were not necessarily the spikes a few years ago or a decade ago. And so therefore, that along with the fact that we had allowed as a world a certain kind of concentration concentration of capacities and production in certain geographies. And we are trying to now even that out, we are trying to correct that, and there is all of this sort of reordering, if you want to call it, of the supply chain, is causing countries to scramble that were not really in the picture anymore. So I think the bigger story is that there is this new world order that is emerging on electronics and semiconductors. And participating in this new world order are countries that were not there in the past. And so therefore there is this scramble, if you want to call it that, for these underlying resources and inputs that go into these industries. So I certainly would agree with the minister that I don't think this is battle, swords are not drawn, blood isn't being spilled. So I would rather refer to this as competition, and I certainly would characterize that on the other side of this is really a framework more and more of cooperation between nations. And we really need to look at that also as an outcome of all these changes that we are going through.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, Minister Mehta, your opinion.
Well, I'm only the partners from the financial sector to that. My sense is that we need to make these issues such as disruption of supply chain more correctly financially, Therefore, that for too much over the estimated of the issues of the critical mineral, for example, that the issue only the stones, and also on the semiconductor issue only the chips. This is not good. We need to cover the full supply chain, and we have to find out what is the problem and how we can solve that problem. That's a very important topic. In 2019, and I was invited by my friend Gordon Fake to the PUS in Western Australia. I delivered a keynote speech at a big conference on critical mineral. At that time, nobody paid attention too much but after during the COVID-19, the disruption of the supply chain happened. So many of too much over-exaggerating kind of focus on this issue. And then, for example, that the country like the United States, for example, they introduced the Chips and Science Act, try to recapture the 4 chips. But it's not the answer so that we need to cover the full supply chain. That's my issue. Therefore, that number is 5.
Thank you very much. And later on in the discussion, I would like to come back also to your country's experience with regard to rare earth and 10 years ago when the supply was cut off and what you learned from that and how you reacted to it. But before we get to this, I would like to ask you, Janka, if you could contextualize the issue a little bit more for us. We are living in a new geopolitical environment, certainly. And some countries have more resources than others. That is sometimes the reason because of geology, but it's sometimes also the reason or the result of political interventions. Some are more advanced with regard to some technologies, and some are lacking more behind. Some are more dependent, some are more vulnerable. You come from a country, Germany, which experienced vulnerability in a very strong way with regard to energy supplies. So tell us a little bit about geopolitics and the scramble, competition, battle for materials.
Maybe I start with saying why I regard this as a battle. I'm a China scholar, that's what I do most of the time. And China sees this as a battle. And I think we have to recognize the reality that this is the case, that China doesn't see this as an area for cooperation, but it sees it as an area for fierce competition. And for competition, that means countries, players have to become more dependent on China, while China becomes less dependent on the world. And that is the underlying feature of the strategies that are behind this. And I think, I understand that politically it makes more sense to talk about competition. And if I were in your positions, I would do the same thing, but luckily I'm not. So I can say a few things maybe a bit more clearly than the way you can politically say them. But I think we have to be very honest about what we're seeing at the moment. The critical raw materials conversation is not the conversation. If we had a critical raw materials problem, then we would all be lucky. That's not the single issue. I think I very much agree with Mr. Maeda. I think this is an integrated problem. This is a question of and highly integrated into the overall system rivalry conversation, and the technology and the raw materials rivalry that we're seeing now is a symptom of that. It's not an issue in itself. It's only part of the supply chain. We have a critical component risk just as much. We have geographic concentration risks. We have know-how risks. We have cybersecurity risks. All of that has to be addressed. And we have fundamentally a risk to our capacity to remain kind of innovative and to sustain our industrial base. And that is one of the major issues that we're facing at the moment. So I would say the critical raw materials questions and the technology questions are part of that. Mm-hmm. But this is part of a broader and a bigger question. And you said the swords have not been drawn. Not sure the Chinese government would interpret US export controls as the swords have not been drawn. This has particularly been seen as the sword is out of the box and it's now visible. And now the question is, how do we deal with it? How can we scramble with this new situation? Maybe just leaving it there and putting that out there.
No, perfect. Thank you so much, Janka. I would like to stay on in the EU for a second. We are dependent on the import of quite a few critical raw materials. The EU puts together a critical raw materials report every few years. And for some of them, we depend 90% of the usage on imports, and sometimes even almost all of this comes from China. Now, Minister Billström, this is not because we don't have some of these resources. We do. I mean, some of them are in your country. How come that the EU is so dependent, and how is the EU reacting?
Well, the reason why we are dependent, I think, is well known to everybody in this room. We don't have to elaborate too much about that. But I think that what we have to come to terms with is the fact that we now face a race, you might call it, almost an arms race, coming back to the military metaphors that we used previously in this discussion. We are in for a question about critical technologies and, as you say, raw materials and also minerals. We can just look at semiconductors. They are not just components in computers, they are also now vital for many countries to get the technological upper hand. And I think that we have to put this into context, and we have to put them in exactly the segment which you were talking about, namely trade relations. And it is for this reason that Sweden, holding the presidency of the European Union, supports and endorses the swift conclusion of trade agreements with countries like Australia, with Indonesia, with India, the country where we are right now. And we welcome also the conclusion of trade agreements signed with New Zealand. And hopefully, I think we will also be able to move on and finalize or resume, I should say, free trade negotiations with countries like Malaysia, Thailand, and the Philippines. And for the Swedish EU presidency, this is a clear priority for the reasons you mentioned. We should also look further afield. We should talk about the important element of the EU-US Trade and Technology Council, which has provided us with an excellent platform for moving on with the question of having a forum for cooperation, just as we spoke about, and seeking to develop transatlantic standards. What we should do is to take this concept of a Trade and Technology Council and transfer it and use it in the relationship between EU and India. And this, I think, brings us to my final observation, so to say. If we really believe that we are in for some kind of, I wouldn't say, competition or cooperation, we have to find partners from the EU, and we have to look further afield. The US is a good partner, we should keep them, but we should look towards India. And that's my final observation. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. Talking about free trade agreements or trade agreements, and already mentioning Australia, this is the perfect lead over to Tony Abbott again. Mr. Abbott, first of all, I mean, your country is very resource rich. Does this put your country into a position of power right now? And the second one is, listening to what we just heard with regard to what the EU wants to do, conclude free trade agreements, are we an easy partner to negotiate with?
Look, Australia wants to be as helpful as we can be. I think Australia has this great sense of mateship, global mateship, as well as local and insular mateship. And I think the point that was made earlier about China is absolutely critical here. China wants the rest of the world to be dependent on it, and it wants to be completely independent for its part of the rest of the world. And this is part of the clearly stated objective of the CCP, to be the world's #1 power by mid-century. And I think we have to appreciate that China uses trade as a weapon in a way that almost no other country does. So I think we have to be very conscious of just how exposed we could be. I think the pandemic was but a foretaste of what could happen. Look at the disruption which is currently being caused by the Ukraine war. Any conflict across the Straits of Taiwan would bring about disruption many orders of magnitude greater than the disruption caused by the Ukraine war. We can take supply chains for granted in an era of globalisation and connectedness. We can't take them for granted in a period of potential conflict between systems and powers. And I really think that every country right now has got to ask itself some very hard questions. Exactly what do we need to maintain the basics of life? Exactly what do we need to maintain our essential safety? How much of it do we have to be able to produce at home? How much of it do we need to stockpile at home? How much of it are we able to rely on trusted friends for? how much are we prepared to depend on the world for? And I think this is a question that does need to be addressed by all countries with great urgency. Great urgency. And given that the consequences of serious conflict would be vastly more immediate than the consequences of, say, climate change, I think it's absolutely essential that we address this with at least the urgency that we're currently bringing to the task of decarbonisation.
Thank you so much for also laying out the instruments already. If I may ask a follow-up question to you, to be resource-rich can be a blessing, but can also create some problems. So for resource-rich countries, is it also now a question of what to extract, how much to extract, and how to manage that?
Well, if you are a well-organised country, having an abundance of resources is obviously a blessing. If you're a disorganised country, having an abundance of resources makes you a target. Now, luckily, Australia is a relatively well-organised country, and our prosperity for a long time now has essentially depended upon our wonderful ability to export iron ore, coal, gas, etc., and increasingly these strategic minerals to the rest of the world. Long may that continue. There is, as well as an external problem though, there's also an internal problem. Part of the problem at the moment in my country is that we, for all sorts of worthy reasons, are reluctant to make the most of some of our resources. I mean, getting new gas projects up and running, getting new coal projects up and running is becoming harder and harder. And given the world's continuing reliance on fossil fuels and likely continuing reliance on fossil fuels for many decades to come, I think this is a problem for us and a problem for you, that because of our understandable green preoccupations, we are making things difficult.
Thank you so very much. I would now like to take a look at Japan, a closer look at your experiences also, and how the Japanese government reacted in 2010 to 2011 to the supply chain interruptions with regard to rare earth, and what other countries can learn from that.
Exactly right. In 2011, that when the government nationalized big disputed islands, very small islands, Senkaku, then China responded back to put a ban on the export of the rare earth element. That's what exactly it's a violation of the WTO rules, so that we appeal to that panel of the WTO. And the issue is that now, at that time, we recognize that very much the threat and also the risk of the Chinese behavior to utilize a scarcity of the critical minerals, and not just only a scarcity, but also that in order to make the project of rare earth element, for instance, is very hard, because everybody focus on rare earth element, but use of the element from the stone ore is very small portion. Therefore, that it is hard to financially viable that is case. China, sometimes disregards that financial viability, and they have some well-developed programs by the autocratic countries. Therefore, that we are very vulnerable. We have to understand that how vulnerable we are, and not just only disruption of supply chain. This is using kind of tactics of this scarcity as a weaponry, as an instrument to threaten the other countries. This is kind of in some sense, it's the economic statecraft of the Chinese model that we have to be prepared. Therefore, that in case of the semiconductor, for example, China is monopolized at the smelting and the processing piece. Therefore, all of that, other countries are very vulnerable of this. Therefore, that we need to share a concern and cooperate each other on diversify that this processing piece. We invested to create a company like Linus in Malaysia to make, and also Australia, It's a very small piece yet, but the first attempt to break through this monopoly by China on this processing piece.
Thank you very, very much. One of the things or instruments you are also very investing in is research for other materials, right? For substitutions, but also recycling. Could you also tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, we need to, anyway, to diversify. That those only one piece of the supply chain, and they also shared by the like-minded countries. So it is not possible to do only one by country, even if it is a big superpower like the United States. Therefore, we have to share the same concern. In this sense, for example, that the framework like IPEF is potentially that the valuable, instrument to draw all of our by the like-minded countries, the 14 members of the negotiation to create this framework under the IPEF. This is still very much preliminary, the views from myself and also that from Japanese government, but we are really eager to do in the framework of IPEF to cover the full supply chain, also diversify, and more free and transparent the supply chain mechanism.
Thank you so much. And the key words, innovation, technology-driven, and investment is the perfect lead over to take a closer look at the Indian perspective and India, which is undergoing a huge change and transformation digitally, but also with regard to climate change. At the same time, also needing a lot of these resources. So what are the government's policies, and how do you also work together with companies to make sure that you have enough access?
So I just, first of all, I just want to clarify on the swords drawn metaphor. So I was not trying to in any way diminish or compromise the narrative that there is this fierce competition going on. I think there are smarter ways of dealing with that is the point that I was making. And we certainly believe that there are ways to get around and win in this very fiercely competitive and evolving space. So that, having said that, let me just refer to your question. Look, we have been for some years, and our government under Prime Minister has been very loudly and from, on as many occasions as possible, talking about the need for the democracies of the world to work together and shape the future of technology in general. And innovation in particular, whether that is semiconductors and electronics, whether that is on the internet. There are so many areas that in a lot of ways that we have as individual governments allowed this thing to get away from us, and then find ourselves in these problematic situations where there is this concentration of electronics capabilities and capacities in a particular geography. We suddenly wake up and find that a certain country has marched well ahead of the rest of the world on AI and are threatening to swamp us. And certainly, I think as democracies, we should be clear about certain clear goals in that the future of tech, and tech is going to be only more intense and more disruptive in the coming decade, that we all, in some sense, figure out a way that we work together to shape that future, rather than be outliers and an occasional competitor or jump into it with a sword drawn when the problem is way beyond our ability to solve. So I think we see innovation, we see the digital economy as increasingly a bigger and bigger piece of what we do, what we experience in India, and we predict the same for the rest of the world. But we are absolutely clear, and we say this again during the G20 with Vasudhaiva Kudumbakam, that the world is one family, that we have to figure out some institutional framework where instead of these occasional conversations about the problems that we're in, that we sit down and have a decade-long perspective on technology, innovation, talent, risk, and materials and resources. We are certainly moving into an era as India where for the first time we are aspiring to be a semiconductor nation. So conversations like this are suddenly becoming more important to us. It wasn't for the last decade. And so with the first fab and hopefully multiple fabs coming up in India and a larger electronics ecosystem, these issues become a lot more pressing and important. And certainly that's why I reiterate that there is a need for more cooperation and a framework where like-minded nations work together to shape the future of technology.
Thank you.
I think
Mr.
the key, as the minister's just said, is like-minded nations.
Absolutely.
And I think the problem that we've had in the last 30 years or so is that we, under the impetus of globalisation, we've put short-term financial gain ahead of long-term strategic gain because we were engaging in wishful thinking about the Beijing government. Now, we have to accept that if we are going to protect ourselves against the predations of an aggressive superpower, we are going to have to pay the price. There is going to be a price. We bought all our stuff from China because it was cheap, but that created an unhealthy dependency. If we're going to buy it from India or from Vietnam, or indeed make it ourselves, at least in the short term, it may well be more expensive, and we just have to accept that there will be a cost of living price to be paid in order to gain the kind of security for our democracy and our freedom that I think has suddenly become much more urgent than we ever thought it would be in the post-1989 world.
Thank you so much. All of you, almost all of you, have mentioned that we need to get together more with like-minded countries. We have heard a lot about decoupling, de-risking, friendshoring, nearshoring, reshoring, trading or decoupling and not trading so much with autocracies anymore. Some are even talking about democratic value chains. So lots of different concepts. All of them are not exactly the same. Janka, does it make sense to envision or have as a goal to decouple and only friendshore?
I think that's a total myth that anyone plans to fully decouple from except for China that would like to decouple and recouple with other partners where the power balance is a different one. So being coupled to countries where you are in the powerful position is an unproblematic situation. Being decoupled from countries that can put pressure on you is a problematic situation. And therefore, this is the dynamic that's going on. It's far more complex than just a decoupling conversation. This is why it's become this myth, because you can say, we're against decoupling, but what are you actually for? And what we are seeing, what we're actually in the reality can observe, is that in the high technology area, we're already seeing these decoupling tendencies because the risk is becoming too high. But what we're also seeing is, and I think that's what I would like to just stress here, it's still always this portrayal as, and if China does the dirty mining and they do the coal and all of that, we have a green technology superpower emerging here, and we're not fast enough in keeping up with the innovation. There is an ecosystem created around this in China that is incredibly challenging for us. And we have to sit down, really hard, think about how we can replicate some of these structural questions that are process questions, that are education questions, that are questions where China has just done a fantastic job in creating an ecosystem in which these innovations are possible, and why then a sodium-ion battery is coming from China and not from Germany. And I think this is something where we need to really question ourselves instead of kind of just saying, oh yeah, everything that China does is bad. For the climate, for example, China's moves towards green energy are really good. And why are they doing that? Because they understand that they're incredibly vulnerable to climate change, and that their coastal cities would be swept away. So therefore, their move forward is investing in these technologies, because these are the technologies of the future, and generating a leadership position there. I think it's really important to just kind of stress that again, why there is a really sensible reason for investing in these technologies. It's not just because we don't like climate change, it's because it's a fundamental threat to how we live.
So for Brussels and the EU, it's not enough to be a regulatory superpower, but we also need to be more of an innovative
it's just not just innovation as well. We also have to think about manufacturing. I think what we're seeing in the US now is this drive as well towards manufacturing again. We have to be able to do, as Sumeda said, the entire supply chain, and we have to be able to have diversity in that. That doesn't mean we need to reshore every single element of that supply chain to our home countries, because that would be nonsensical, but we have to de-risk all of these elements where there's a high concentration in certain geographic locations when there's a problem.
I see you nodding quite vigorously.
Yeah, which is why I prefer using phraseology like de-risk and creating a new equilibrium in the supply chains rather than having all of it concentrated in one country. And I think that is really the challenge. That is what all of us are grappling with. And so you can characterize it any which way you want, but certainly I think the supply chains that we were used to, that were driven by price and opportunism, as Tony mentioned, are being re-architected, are being redesigned, where trust, some amount of cooperation between countries that anchor these supply chains is underway. So I think that's certainly the right way to describe what we're going through right now.
I would now like to open it up for questions, and I would love to have if they are present, the young Raisina fellows, the young leaders, to go first with their question.
Thank you, panel.
They're vigorously waving.
Yeah, they're vigorously waving back there. Okay, all right. So the first question goes to, and please always introduce your name.
Hi, thank you, panel, for the lovely presentation. I'm Chamira Yapa from Sri Lanka. My question is, when value chain realignment actually takes center stage, there'll be opportunities afforded for smaller countries like Sri Lanka, especially in terms of mineral resources mining. But there'll be questions on investments and exploitation, and from a prism of from greenery also, whether there'll be pollution. So is there any green financing model that on the basis of the COD or any on the basis of the new focus on financing that you're intended to evolve to help the small countries with the investments? Thank you.
Thank you so very much. And I would suggest that we collect 3 questions. Is there another one by the young Raisina fellows?
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Hello, my name is Maria. I'm from MMO Russia. I would like to ask about critical infrastructure and Huawei. Despite all discussions, the European country keep different approaches to Huawei on 5G. I would like to ask, are the EU countries going to develop some consolidated position toward Huawei, and what kind of position, if any? Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I'm so glad that you raised this issue, because I wanted to have it in this, on this panel, but we didn't yet get to it. Anybody else? Yes. Maybe from this side. Yes, please.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Dheeraj Yadav. My question is to Minister Rajiv Chandrasekhar. Sir, we have seen in the past that how social media giants like Twitter bans and breaks Indian rules and guidelines. So suppose at the time of elections, some social media giants deplate firms or ban senior political leader of a party, then what will be government of India's response to that? And sir, my second question is, what steps are government of India taking to become Atmanirbhar, self-reliant in the chips, apart from the Foxconn Vedanta deal? Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, and we take one last one. Yes, please.
Chintan Vaishnav, I am the chair of Startup 20 engagement group for G20, and also lead India's innovation mission. My question is a little bit broader. I realize that we are focused on supply chains and minerals here, but if you step out a bit, you know, in almost all supply chains, there is a dramatic shift by the time you come to a product. There's a dramatic shift in where the value is created versus captured, because of a variety of things, you know, industrial to knowledge economy, hardware to software, whatever it is. So my question is possibly for Australia and anybody who has resources, are minerals as valuable as they used to be by the time they turn into products?
Thank you so much. Such an important point, and You're right, we focused a lot on metals and minerals, touching a little bit on semiconductors. But if we talk about raw materials or resources, we certainly also need to think about water and also foodstuffs. We didn't cover that at all on our panel, but these are going to be really big issues as well. 4 very, very good questions. And who would like to start on our panel?
If I may point out that throughout our history, we have been an exporter of raw materials and agricultural products. We've never had a substantial industrial base, but despite the fact that we have tended to be at the low end of the supply chain, so to speak, we've always had a very high standard of living. That's because while we have tended to dig the stuff out of the ground and grow it, rather than further refine and develop it onshore, we've been good at doing it, and therefore we've been able to develop large markets and make good returns on what we've done. So, look, I think the issue here is not so much do we have to go from primary production to kind of industrialisation. The issue is can we ensure that we get what we need from industrialisation from people we can trust? Because plainly we can't trust the people who we've mostly been getting it from over the last 20 odd years.
Thank you so much. Would you like to continue? Yeah, please.
Yeah, let me answer the questions that were posed to me. I think there was one question which is really not linked to materials in any way, which is about social media. And the answer to that question is, I don't think it's possible anymore. We have now created a framework of rules and laws that restrict the wiggle room for social media platforms to do what they've been doing for some years now, and we found out recently with these Twitter exposés. So I think we are quite clear that if there is any arbitrariness in the way platforms respond to citizens of India, the rules that we have just enacted will kick in, and at the very minimum, they will lose the safe harbor that they enjoy from prosecution under the law. So that's the first question. The second question was about a fab, and I can certainly say that, without getting into too much detail, that we will be announcing the government support for a fab very shortly. It's a CMOS fab, and the due diligence and the process, given the amount of capital and the complexity of the technology that is being transferred to the fab, is currently under scrutiny. But for those who are looking forward to it, good news is around the corner.
Thank you so much. Minister Mehta, and then...
Yes. On the top of the answers by the Minister, that Director addressed also that the issues related with the climate change, also the more broader SDGs. For example, that case of the cobalt, one of the very critical minerals. Now, the heavily in the Republic of Congo, for example, this is obviously it's a violation of the child labors in some conventional human rights issue. Therefore, that technology is now trying to escape from using cobalt into alternative, the mineral. That's one example. Secondly, that every industry now shifting to the EV, electric vehicles, so that the electric vehicles, if while driving, is not the emission of carbon dioxide gas, but in the manufacturing stage, there's some, using a emission of carbon dioxide gas. Therefore, that's the life cycle assessment is very important, so that we need to, in line with this life cycle assessment, using on the minerals sector as well. That's the one point.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Do we get one more minute for Janka and Mr. Billström? Minister, one? Yeah, Please, Minister.
Thank you very much. Yes, I would just like to pick on the theme again of cooperation, because I think this is where we started, so we should end there as well. And as you know, Sweden is a major innovative country, and we invest approximately, I think, 2 to 3% of our annual GDP in research and development and innovation. And this is, of course, a good thing in itself, but coming back to the question of supply chains and cooperation, I think that we need partnership not only to secure the supply chains for new technologies, but it's also necessary for the innovation process itself. And you know, we talked about minerals a lot. Now we found this grand deposit of rare earth oxides, 1 million tons in Sweden. It's the largest deposit in Europe, but of course it's something which we would like to share and have to share with the rest of the world in cooperation. And incidentally, we're open to business.
And the very last word to you.
I think I should address the question that was raised on Huawei, but it would take about 25 to 30 minutes to answer it properly, so I will just give you the short version. It's complicated. It will remain complicated, but the largest markets now for the European champions in these sectors are the US and India, and not Europe, and that's a problem as well.
Give my panelists a huge applause. This was an amazing panel. Thank you very, very, very much.